Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about a real problem that is starting to emerge for Russia with regards to its oil exports, because exports are leaving Russia. Lots of ships are being filled with oil, but those ships now don't have anywhere to go because of the sanctions, and particularly the increase in the sanctions and the fact that Rosneft and Lukoil, the two biggest oil companies in Russia, have now been hit with direct sanctions. So nobody can officially buy any oil from those two producers anymore. So oil is leaving Russia and it's now sitting on the seas. And Bloomberg has calculated that over 1 billion barrels of oil are now floating at sea. Now, not all of those barrels of oil belong to Russia. We have a look at this chart. These are the three big agencies that produce data on how much oil is being transported at any particular time. And what this chart shows is the increase in the amount of oil that's now floating on the sea in tankers since the end of August. So we're looking at a 2 month period between the end of August and the end of October. And the color coding here, the black section shows the oil that's being produced by Russia, Iran, and Venezuela, who are all sanctioned to various extents. Russia's obviously the most heavily sanctioned, but Venezuela's also quite heavily sanctioned. It was doing a lot of trade with the USA historically before it got sanctioned, and now it's not really doing a great deal. And the blue section here isn't actually other countries. What that's covering is basically stuff that's floating storage. So, where there's been a deliberate move to just fill the tanker and then send it out to sea and then just wait for a deal to be struck. So, some of that could actually relate to Russia as well. In fact, it's likely that a good chunk of that blue section is relating to Russian oil. But what this shows is that Vortexa, who's the biggest agency, estimates that around 75 million additional barrels of oil are now floating on the sea in that period between August and October, directly relating to Russia, Iran, and Venezuela. And in total, more than 200 million barrels of oil additionally have been added to the amount that's floating on the sea. And if we have a look at the breakdown of how much relates to Russia, you can see from this chart the movement in the amount of oil that's now just sitting on tankers for Russia between January and October 2025. Now, before the war in Ukraine started, Russia was exporting somewhere between 3.5 and 4 million barrels of oil per day via the sea. So that doesn't include any of the pipelines that it was sending to Europe and China. And around about 10 days worth of supply would have been sitting on the sea. So we're talking probably around about 35 million barrels of oil in transit at any one point. If we look at the start of 2025, that had increased to 344 million barrels of oil sitting on the ocean. And now that's up to 390 million. So this is a huge increase. Russia, whilst it's producing that oil and it's pumping it onto tankers, it's not actually being delivered to anybody for a number of different reasons. So if we just go through the reasons why this is happening, well, obviously the sanctions are having a huge impact. So over the last 3 years, we've had the cap that was applied in terms of the amount that Russia was allowed to be paid. So that was initially set at $60 per barrel. And at times, that was actually fine from Russia's point of view, because when the price comes down, $60 was actually quite a healthy sales price. But what's happened now is that we've got a new price cap. So it's been set at 15%, the prevailing market rate. So that always means that Russia has to pay a discount. So the price cap is starting to hurt official Russian exports. But as you'll know, Russia has been bypassing the cap by using other methods, by sending oil on the grey fleet or the shadow fleet, whatever you want to call it. So basically tankers that have not been able to be tracked. So it's hard to actually say who's delivering that oil, where they're going, where they got the oil from. So very difficult to police that. But the biggest impact, I think, over the past 12 months has been the ramping up of the policing of the sanctions. So we have seen the West starting to implement secondary sanctions. So when they're finding counterparties who are dealing with sanctioned entities in Russia, then they're being hit with sanctions. So Indian and Chinese banks have become more cautious about this. And then the direct sanctions that were applied against Rosneft and Lukoil recently have really hurt Russian trade because they're the two biggest companies. You're no longer allowed to officially buy oil directly from them. So we've got the direct sanctions, and this is starting to cause problems for Russia because, firstly, none of the ship operators want to deal with Russian oil. Then you've got the complication of insurance. So a lot of the insurance is provided by the West. And then the ports themselves can also be hit with sanctions. So up until the last 12 months, we saw India and China and Turkey taking a lot of that Russian oil, but they're now starting to pull back from those purchases. And as a result of this, Russia is having to store some of its oil on the sea. And in terms of the financial implications of this, well, if you think about 390 million barrels of oil that are currently sitting on the sea that are Russian, it might be actually more than that because, as we saw, that big blue section that we don't have the breakdown for, a big chunk of that could well be coming from Russia as well. So it could be as much as 500 million barrels we're talking about here, or maybe even more than that. But if we talk about the price of Russian oil being around about $54 per barrel right now, 390 million barrels would equate to $21 billion worth of revenue for Russia that's currently stranded at sea. And if prices go up for oil, then obviously it could get as much as 25 billion. So this is oil that Russia has processed. It's gone through all of its cost. It's pulled it out of the ground. It's pumped it onto the tankers. It's now on board and on the ocean, but it doesn't have anywhere to go. And somebody's got to pay for that ship and the crew and the insurance. So this is costing Russia money, but it's not getting anything in return. It's not getting any cash flow. So this is quite a clever way of Russia being able to continue producing oil because it doesn't have anywhere to store the oil on its land. So it's filling up all of these tankers, but ultimately it will run out of this storage space because there's not an unlimited amount of tankers that you can keep filling up forever. So at some point, Russia will have to cut back on its production because it's not making genuine sales. It's going through the motions of producing the oil, loading it onto tankers as if there is an order, and those tankers are then sailing off to sea. But because there's no port to actually deliver to, and there's no end buyer, Russia isn't being paid. So this is all proving to be an absolute nightmare from a cash flow point of view. And of course, the ultimate loser here will be the oil companies and the Russian economy, because if they're not banking that revenue, but they're still incurring all of their costs, then they're not going to make any profit. They're not going to pay any tax to the Russian economy. And so Russian GDP will start to implode when the impact of all of this oil that's now just floating around starts to feed through into the financial results. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because we've been talking about the sanctions that have been applied against Russia for more than 3.5 years. That is a long period of time. And over that time, lots of people have sent me messages saying the sanctions aren't working, they're not effective, they're not stopping Russia, Russia's carrying on as normal, it's not going to bring an end to the war in Ukraine. But I think over the past few months, we have really seen the sanctions starting to bite. Since the peace process that Donald Trump tried to put into place with President Putin has failed, he's now turned and looked to increase the amount of sanctions that are hurting Russia. And I think the biggest impact that we've seen recently has been the direct sanctioning of the two biggest oil companies, Rosneft and Lukoil. But what we've seen in today's video is that Russia, whilst it appears to be carrying on as normal, all of the oil operations are operating at full capacity. They're pulling as much oil out of the ground. They're loading up tankers. They're sending those tankers off to sea. All of that looks like business as usual. It isn't business as usual because the buyers, the end users of those oil products have disappeared. So even India and China have pulled back in terms of the amount of oil that they're buying from Russia, as has Turkey. And as the new sanctions really start to kick in, I think we will see an escalation in the pullback from those purchases because the global oil supply is now sufficient that India and China and Turkey don't need to buy Russian oil. At the start of the war, there was a reluctance to apply all of these sanctions because it could have thrown the whole global economy into recession if we didn't have enough oil and oil prices spiked to $200 per barrel. However, now we've got a surplus of oil. The Russian oil supply isn't as important as it was. So there are alternatives for everybody to turn to, and Russia is really suffering at the moment. And what we've seen in today's video is that it's now estimated that there are over 1 billion barrels of oil currently floating at sea. Now, that is a lot of oil to be sitting on tankers. Now, it's not just Russian oil. We do have some from countries like Iran and Venezuela who are also struggling with regards to their sanctions. And the reason why all of these countries are loading up on tankers is that they don't have anywhere to store the oil. And we've talked about it many times before. But the last thing that you want to do if you've got your oil facility operating nice and efficiently is to put the brakes on to try to slow down the flow of oil, because that will cause you problems immediately, but also in the long term when you want that oil to start flowing fast again. So nobody wants to turn off the tap. But if you don't have any buyers, then what are you going to do with all of the oil? Well, the answer to that over the past couple of months, or the past 12 months, or the past 2 years, is to put it onto tankers and send those tankers off into the ocean. But once you run out of tankers, what can you do then? Well, you're going to have to stop your production. And that's one of the problems that Russia is potentially facing down the road here, because it's lost all of its buyers. So it's not got anybody to take the actual delivery of that oil. And when it runs out of tankers, it certainly will have to pull back on its production. And that could cause some major long-term problems for the Russian oil industry, because a lot of those facilities are in very cold climate areas, and we're going into winter right now. But the other impact on Russia is obviously the loss of revenue, because the amount of oil that it's currently got sitting at sea is somewhere between 20 and 25 billion. Could actually be a lot more than that, because we don't have the full data on the other oil that's just been put out there for storage purposes. So Russia is losing tens of billions of dollars of revenue at the same time as it's losing its customers, at the same time as it's likely that it's going to have to cut back on production, which will hurt the oil industry in the long term, as will all of the sanctions, because the fewer and fewer buyers that Russia has means that it's just not going to get any money. So the walls are certainly closing in on Russia right now. The oil industry is under severe pressure because it's no longer as important to the global supply of oil as it was. The rest of the world can live without Russian oil, but Russia certainly can't live without the revenue from its oil sales. So this represents a serious problem for Russia at the time when the Russian economy is already struggling. It's already overspending on the war in Ukraine. It's spending more than it's earning. It's been using its national wealth fund to fund the difference. That is running out. So Russia is soon facing the prospect of either having to raise a lot of debt, or to cut back on its spending, or to stop the war in Ukraine so that the sanctions are lifted. But ultimately, there are serious problems facing the Russian economy right now. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video. You found it useful, informative, and hopefully thought-provoking. That's what I'm trying to do. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already. And thank you so much to everyone that's supported me. If you've bought me a coffee, or sent me a YouTube super thanks, or signed up as a Patreon or YouTube member, or buy me a coffee member, thank you for that support. Really, really appreciate it. And here's something to put a smile on your face.